welcome to AAU Talks on AAU TV. I am your host, Georgina Mason. Today we will be addressing the challenges of quality education in Africa. Our guest for today is a lecturer at the University of Professional Studies, Accra. He is the immediate past Secretary General of the All African Students Union, ASU. He is Mr. Fred Awal. Thank you for coming, Mr. Awal.
Thank you.
So to dive right in, what would you say quality education is?
Well, quality education, I will be speaking from the lenses of higher education. Yeah, so the two key issues that are concerned in the phrase is quality and higher education. Mm-hmm. So higher education basically has to do with the level of education post-secondary, or the level of education after the secondary school. So universities, polytechnics that give diplomas, first degrees, bachelors, masters, doctorals, all come directly under higher education. Now, the second issue we have a responsibility to digest on is the issue of quality. Quality basically has to do with meeting or exceeding the expectations of what?
Your stakeholders.
Stakeholders. So that if we want to know if education is of quality or otherwise, there is the need for us to understand whether stakeholders are satisfied with the kind of education that we have within the confines of the African region. So such stakeholders are students. Are we meeting their expectations? Mm-hmm. Governments. Are we meeting their expectations? Potential employers. Are we meeting their expectations? Donor partners. Are we meeting their expectations? So quality education, primary definition, is higher education that meets or exceeds the expectations of stakeholders of higher education within Africa.
Okay. Could you give me a brief history on higher education in Africa?
Well, as far as I am concerned, the history of higher education in Africa dates back before Christ. Mm-hmm. Yes, we can talk about such institutions as the Alexandria College in Egypt, that was established in 331 BC. Oh. We can talk about other institutions such as the Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone, which was established somewhere in 1827. Mm-hmm. So higher education on the face of our continent is not new. There is always this mistake and temptation to reason that higher education began only when the colonial masters came into Africa. Mm-hmm. But records have proven that higher education has been with us too long. And indeed, it is a product of building up on those structures and introducing new structures that constitute the current system of higher education that we are running as Africans.
Okay. Since our topic today is on challenges of quality education, could you also give me some history on challenges that we have faced in our higher education institutions?
Well, higher education, just like a number of human endeavors, have seen a number of challenges elsewhere and in Africa. Mm-hmm. Particularly in Africa, I want to take us back to the 70s and 80s, where Africa was experiencing some level of economic downturn. Yeah, the entirety of the region of Africa had challenges, perhaps except for South Africa and some countries in the Northern African region. So because of these, a number of intervention measures were put in place to curb this downturn. Mm-hmm. One key strategy then was the structural adjustment program, mm-hmm. which had a number of consequences. And one of such was the fact that African academics decided to leave our countries to seek greener pastures elsewhere. African governments did not have so much funds to invest into what? Our educational system. So educational budgets were cut to the minimum. Okay. Okay. Students were not getting the right facilities to study. Mm-hmm. So there were high incidences of strikes and demonstrations. So the real beginning of our challenges can be attributed to the economic downturns in the 70s and the 80s. And that is what has brought us to some of the challenges we're still facing today. Although some level of improvements have been gained in Africa's higher education since the 70s and the 80s.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges that we are facing now in our day today?
Well, a number of challenges can be outlined. One of the key issues is the issue of access, access to higher education. So many African students who desire to go to African universities, unfortunately do not have access to get in there. It is either the university doesn't have the capacity to what? Absorb them, or that students do not even have funding to be able to enroll on university to some of these universities. Now, the works of Mba, in his works, Challenges and Prospects of Africa's Higher Education, Mba in 2017 argued that only 5% of the people of the age brackets who want to go into university have access to what? University education across the continent of Africa, which is way less than the world average of 25%.
Wow.
Okay, so it is important to understand that one of the key or most cardinal challenge from my perspective is the issue of access, where African universities exist but do not have the capacity to absorb what? Students who have the requisite qualification to get into African universities.
Would you say that is a cause of the economic downturns you mentioned earlier?
Well,
so the universities don't have enough educators in the school to accept enough students?
No, absolutely no. It has nothing to do with the economic downturn. The economic downturns was a product of the 70s and the 80s.
So we are done with that.
Absolutely, and actually that actually gave way to some of the challenges that we still face today. But the issue of access, we can attribute it to funding, which is one other key element or problem of what? Higher education in Africa. So for instance, if a university can only take 1,000 students in an academic semester, it means that they have less what? Academic facilities. They have less lecturers. They have less research what? Facilities. And in that instance, there is no way they can absorb what? Persons who are willing and ready to study. So to curb the issue of access, there is the need for what? More funding to go into higher education. And that is one of the key challenges of what? Higher education that has been found. Because if there is no funding, you cannot improve academic infrastructure. You cannot improve research facilities. You cannot improve hostel facilities. You cannot improve the academic environment under which students are expected to what? To study. So indeed, access is one, and funding is another key challenge. There's also the issue of skill mismatch that has been attributed to Africa's higher education. Skill mismatch basically means that African education churns out students who are not able to what? Resolve the issues of industry, meaning their skill does not match with the requirements of what? Industry. So in that sense, you bring out graduates who cannot find jobs. Meanwhile, there are jobs. Do you understand?
Yes.
Meaning that your skill that the skill that is given to you in school, it's not what society actually needs. So we complain of unemployment, yet industry also complains of students or graduates not being able to solve what? Industry problems. So there are jobs, graduates cannot what? Take advantage of them. And universities are also complaining that their graduates are not getting what? Jobs. So a number of researchers have looked at the issue of skill mismatch. One of such is Alabi and Mba 2012. They identified that 3 cardinal issues are associated with the issues of skill mismatch. One of them is unqualified faculty or lecturers. So if the lecturer does not have the skill, knowledge, and attitude needed to impart knowledge, it means that the content of what you take out will not represent what industry wants. The second is the issue of leadership. When universities do not have good what? Management or leadership, then tendencies are that at the end of the period, students would come out being products of a mismanaged university. And then the third is also the issue of resources. When universities do not have the resources to be able to what? Train students to be able to meet the demands of industry.
Do you think a way to solve this might be if our institutions modify their course outlines so they teach what industry is actually requesting or needs?
Well, that would aptly I would have discussed it. That is the issue of curriculum design. Now, curriculum design basically means what we are studying in school. What informs the design of our curriculum? That is a question that African higher educational institutions should be what? Asking themselves. Because a holistic curriculum design should involve such stakeholders as industry. Because majorly on the face of our continent, a lot of our graduates get out to work in what? Industry. So there is the need for feedback from industry so that would inform the kind of curriculum that we design. So that if industry says that these are the skills that are lacking in industry, you revise your curriculum to meet the demands of what? Industry. So it is one way that we can use to curb the issue of skill mismatch. And sometimes we recommend that industry should have talks on African campuses, like issues of programs that students have on campuses. You can invite industry practitioners to be able to talk to you about what is required in industry. Sometimes we also encourage the issue of industrial attachments so that students get to understand what industry needs before they graduate from universities. This in some way would help curb the issue of skill mismatch.
So we would be going for a very short commercial break. Please stay tuned and join us later.
Hello, I'm Adeline Addy, Project Officer responsible for the Management Development Training Workshops here at the Association of African Universities, Accra, Ghana. Today I would like to introduce to you our Management Development Training Workshops, which we call MADEV in short. The workshops are targeted at middle-level managers of our universities, so that includes heads of department, deans of faculties, deputy vice chancellors, registrars, bursars, and anyone who aspires to any of these positions. We have a workshop coming up very soon and would be holding in Nairobi, Kenya. It will focus on staff development, staff recruitment, staff retention, and staff motivation issues. The workshop will be facilitated by Professor Pascal Mio, former Executive Director of the Organization for Social Science Research in Africa. Participants would have to pay $500 per head. Participants from Kenya would be paying $300 per head. The workshop will be holding from the 26th to the 29th of June 2018. We are calling out to all our members and anyone who is eligible for this workshop, even if you are not in an AAU member institution, to register for this all-important event. You can register online via our website at blog.aau.org. We are looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you and bye.
In case you just joined us, this is AAU Talks on AAU TV. Today we are discussing the challenges of quality education in Africa. Our guest is Mr. Fred Awal. Please don't forget to give comments, like the video, and visit our Twitter page. Our Twitter handle is AAU_67. So with Mr. Awal today, we have discussed the brief history of education in higher education in Africa. We've discussed some of our challenges that we have been facing, and we would like to discuss the rest. Mr. Awal, so what are the other challenges that we face in higher education?
Well, I think one other key challenge which has to do with higher education on the face of our continent is the issue of credit transfers. Credit transfers basically means that if a student, for instance, in Nairobi University is in level 200, and the parents are transferred to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and he has to move to the University of Addis Ababa. Now, African universities largely do not have a system that transfers what? Credit. So that University of Addis Ababa will be able to determine where he fits in and where he continues. And this is a very big challenge to our continent, given that a lot of students will want to move from one part of Africa to the other to study, or to continue their study based on where they have started. And much as this looks simple, there's even one other one which is difficult. That is moving from an Anglophone university to what? A Francophone. Or from a Lusophone to an Arabophone, and all of that. So the issue of credit transfer is another key challenge that African universities would have to what? Address, because we are talking about a global Africa now, where a Kenyan should be free to move to Ghana. A Ghanaian should be free to move to Nigeria. So if universities across the continent do not have standardized guidelines, okay, pertaining to how credits can be transferred from one university to another in this time and age, it is worrisome. Because indeed, Africans move to Europe to study, and one of the key issues that has to do with studies in Europe is the issue of getting one degree from 2 or 3 universities. I can cite the issue of Erasmus Mundus. You start a program from University A in Spain, continue in University B in Belgium, and then end up in University C in Holland. It means that there is a system that transfers your credit from what? One university to another. But I'm sure a lot of us studied within this African context, and at a given time you even want to move from one university in the same country to another, and there is no system of what? Transferring your credits. And that is one key challenge that Africa faces. Another is the issue of government interference. Universities are expected to be autonomous, devoid of interferences from what? Governments. But it looks to me, in my research, that a lot of African universities have their hands twisted by government. Now, the research of the works of Ibrahim Onda is instructive here. In his article, How Political Interference Keep Hurting African Universities, he posited that a number of African universities are not independent, such that the appointment of vice chancellors, student leaders, award of contracts in universities, etc., are influenced by what? Government or politicians. So this goes to say that universities that have a mandate sometimes would compromise on the mandate because of the influence of what? Politicians. Now, the Economist magazine in May 2016 also brought further evidence to this in the case of Forabe College, where students were demonstrating because they did not want government to influence decisions in what? Their school or university. So if African higher education will make strides, it is important for African politicians to understand that politics must be devoid of academia, so that academic institutions or institutions of higher learning would concentrate on their mandate, deliver that to the benefit of all stakeholders, including government and the politicians. Yes, so that is one factor that we want to consider. If you permit me, I also want to look at the issue of academic corruption.
Yeah, permitted.
Yes, as one of the key factors that undermine the growth and development of higher education in Africa. Yeah, here the works of Okebukola 2016 is very instructive. In his paper, Academic Corruption as an ethical, as issues of ethics, I think so, posited that academic corruption has to do with every form of cheating, okay, that gives an undue advantage to one person in an academic enterprise, meaning that plagiarism is still common with African academics and students, okay? Awarding marks wrongfully to students is still common with what? African universities. Are we together?
Yes.
Outsourcing theses, letting people write theses for you, which traditionally is not supposed to be so, is still an issue of what? African universities. Falsification of entry certificates to be able to get into universities. Yeah. Copying whilst in class, and a whole lot. Any of such compromises the standard of quality education on the face of our continent. And I think that to make a lot of gains, there is the need for us to look at all of these issues as problems or challenges that face higher education on the face of our continent.
Okay. If you didn't see the video already, there's on AAU Talks, last time we had Mr. Awal here, we discussed academic corruption. So please go and check that video out on the Association of African University Facebook page. Thank you. Mr. Awal, so after giving us all these challenges, what is the way forward for Africa now?
Well, a holistic way forward should be found, but for now, I think there are some other issues that I'll need to touch on. I think my former constituents may not forgive me if I don't touch on this particular problem that has to do with higher education. That's the issue of student unrests, strikes. Okay.
Yes.
Every higher educational institution has issues that have to do with timetables. Higher educational institutions work according to what? Timetables. Okay, so they have targets to achieve within a semester or a year. So if there are continual demonstrations and strikes, it affects the quality of teaching and education in African higher educational institutions. And these strikes are not only related to students. There are instances in higher educational institutions in Africa where academic staff also go on strike because their needs have not been met. Now, whilst I was still Secretary General of the All African Students Union, one of the key issues that I had to do advocacy on was the issue of what? Students, bridging the gap between students and management of universities. Reality remains that as long as students are seen as aliens in the university environment, that they are seen as children and are not brought together to discuss issues, their option would always remain what? Strikes and then unrest. So for instance, in 2013, there was an instance in Nigeria, Nasarawa State University, where some students were shot down for demonstrating. And the reality is that they were not demonstrating unjustly. They were demonstrating because they wanted electricity and water. So there must be a mechanism where students must be heard. And when they are heard and their genuine demands are catered for, then obviously the issue of what? Academic unrest would be minimal, and higher educational institutions would have a leeway to manage their institutions very well. The issue of technology also is a challenge to Africa's higher education.
Mr. Awal, not to cut you short, but would you say that the unrest is caused by the fact that institutions see, they don't see themselves as providing a service, but rather as giving a commodity out?
You see, the reality is that in Africa's higher educational system, there is this perception or mentality of a parent-child relationship. And that is a traditional concept of the African. Okay, so the lecturer sees the student as a son or daughter. Okay, and in the traditional African setting, sons and daughters only take instructions from what? parents, hither to times back. And this concept has dragged itself into the higher educational arena, where university management, a lot of times, will just want to what? Take decisions for students without recourse to the contributions of the students. And indeed, with technology and the issue of modernization, students understand that they have a say in whatever environment they find themselves in, including higher education. So if you get them involved in decision-making processes, students would go out being advocates or ambassadors of the management of the institution in implementing such decisions. However, if you leave them out, they will resist it. And the biggest form of resistance that African students understand is the issue of strikes and demonstrations, because that is what will stop you to listen to them. So I think that strikes and resistances can be brought to a minimal if institutions of higher learning see students as key stakeholders and then involve them in the decision-making processes of higher educational institutions in Africa.
But some institutions would say, I have an SRC, a Student Representative Council, so that is me doing my part. Would you agree with such institutions?
By virtue of the fact of my previous work, I realized that the issue of representation in most higher educational institutions in Africa doesn't go beyond the SRC. Now, being SRC means that you are the mouthpiece of students. But when you are taking decisions pertaining the entire university, there is the need for students to be represented. I should say that some countries have done this very well. Countries like Ghana have done this very well. In almost actually, but all of the public universities in Ghana, SRC, or the Student Representative Council, is represented on what? The academic council of the universities. So they make decisions, they help in the decision-making process. So you realize that the issue of unrest in Ghana is somehow what? Lower. Minimal. It is not the same for a number of African universities. In so many African universities, students are not involved in decision-making what? Processes. So the case of Ghana, I should emphatically say that it is not even only at the SRC level. At the national level, the National Union of Ghana Students is represented in key decision-making platforms like the National Youth Authority, the Student Loan Trust Fund, the Ghana Educational Trust Fund, the Ghana AIDS Commission, amongst others. Do you understand?
Yes.
But this is not the case in other jurisdictions within Africa. Students are seen as isolated. And then there is this tendency to think that if you bring them in, they will disrupt the processes. But reality is that if you do not bring them in, the tendency to disrupt is higher, because if they do not understand the decisions that are going to be implemented, the leeway is to disrupt it.
So now onto our solutions.
Okay, how to solve the issues of the challenges that have been iterated. One of the key ways of resolving this is to massively expand higher educational facilities. Massively expanding higher educational facility means that to give access to a number of students, the colonial structures that we inherited must be what? Widened. Many more classrooms must be what? Built in the universities. More lecturers must be hired. More library facilities must be increased. There should be more hostels. In that regard, room would be given to so many students who are qualified but hitherto could not what? Have access to higher education. So this is one way of resolving the issues of the problems of higher education, especially the issue of access. Now, the second is curriculum reforms. Curriculum reforms meaning that there is the need to redesign our curriculum. That is what we are being taught or what we teach in African universities to conform to the local African situations. So for instance, if you are studying medicine, there is the need to investigate into the neem tree and then see how it can treat what? Malaria. Are we together?
Yes.
Yeah. There is the need to look at our curriculum again there are some things that, some issues that we still study in our universities that do not have relevance to what? The current happenings in Africa. So there is the need to review them to conform to what happens to our continent today. There's also further need for improvement in funding. Mostly we say that government should fund. Yes, government has a quota for higher education in most countries, but there is the need for higher educational institutions to also expand their scope of funding. For instance, public-private partnerships. I can give an example. A number of the infrastructural development in one of the African universities, University of Professional Studies, Accra, is a product of public-private partnerships. Hitherto, they did not have hostel facilities. But today, they do, not because government provided the funds, but because the school, together with the SRC, contracted a bank, Access Bank, to get that done so that they can pay within a long period of time. Now, there is also the need to what? Establish endowment funds, okay, that can generate excess resources to be able to manage some of the problems of higher education. We also recommend entrepreneurship what? Drive. I was in Crawford University somewhere in 2015 on an AAU ECOWAS fellowship. Right from the scratch, students who are learning entrepreneurship just do not learn it theoretically. Every student who does entrepreneurship has a physical entrepreneurial project. Could be soap making, it could be clothes making. So by the time you get out of university, the issue of unemployment would not exist in your dictionary, because there is a way that you have been taught entrepreneurship to what? Conform to your personal demand before meeting the demands of society. Okay, so these are all feasible ways. And I also talked about the issue of student unrest. If you involve students, it's been proven that if you involve students in decision-making processes, they will not disrupt academic calendars. So right from the highest level to the least, continental bodies such as the All African Students Unions should be represented in all continental educational drives, like at the AAU level, at the AU level, at Trust Africa level. And I think that continental organizations have done well in that drive by involving the All African Students Union. Even the European Union, UNESCO, have involved the All African Students Union in issues that have to do with higher education on the face of the continent. When students understand the policy drive, then they would work together with stakeholders in order to achieve that. But I just talked about the level of the All African Students Union, but it is not typically so at national students union levels. Governments do not involve their national student unions. In a lot of instances in Africa, governments see national student unions as resistant groups. And if you continually see national student unions as resistant groups, they have the largest constituents on the campuses. And if you see them as resistant groups, they definitely will live by the name that you give them. Because whatever name you prescribe to a student is what he's likely to live with. If you say students are responsible and then give them roles of responsibility, students would adhere. But if you brand them irresponsible, be sure that you get evidence of that from students. Okay, then there is the need to also emphasize on science and mathematics education. Science is what reforms every economy. Okay, but it looks to me in our part of the world, we don't have so many scientific universities. We don't have teachers who teach the sciences in our universities. Not as if we don't have them, but proportionately, I think that they are less. So there is the need to invest in science education, because that is what brings about reforms in a number of what?
Institutions.
Economies. So Africa seems to be lagging behind in this, and there is the need for us to refocus our thinking towards science education.
Mr. Awal, how can institutions prevent governments from interfering in their day-to-day activities?
That's a very big question, and it's one of the biggest challenges that higher education in Africa face. Reality is that government is the biggest funder of higher education in Africa. For almost all African countries, the chunk of the money and resources needed to manage higher education comes from government. So sometimes they are tempted to dance to the tune of government when it becomes necessary. So this question on different platforms is come up at COREVEP, Conference of Rectors, Vice Chancellors and Presidents of African Universities. It's come out at different levels, including UNESCO and the European Commission, as to how there would be a fine balance with institutions working with governments without government necessarily interfering. I do think that the solution largely would not come from the universities, but from governments, that is the politicians. Reality is that if politicians understand that education is a mandate that is supposed to bring about development to African economies, they would let African universities be autonomous as the word autonomy is. They don't influence the appointment of vice chancellors. They don't influence the election of student leaders, award of contracts and all of that. If that is done, then you have people with key or core competencies that are able to manage the university to deliver the goods that is expected to transform our continent. However, a lot of African politicians are short-sighted. Now, when they come into power, they have an agenda they would have to execute. This is not an academic agenda. It is a political agenda which academia must fit into for them. So a lot of time it is not the issue of the higher education practitioners, but it's an issue of the governments or the politicians. So I think that if there would be a solution, largely it will be from political lenses and not academic lenses.
So are there any more solutions that we would need to know about?
No, basically not so many as I want to speak on, except for the fact that university education is based on 3 cardinal pillars: teaching, research, and community what? Development. Now, if Africa would make gain in the area of higher education, then there is the need for us to invest in proper research, not just research. And all of us here who have gone through African universities have done one research or the other. But the reality is, what African solution have these researches helped resolve? So instead of just writing thesis in partial fulfillment of a first degree, a diploma, a second degree, or a doctoral program, it is important that university tailor their researches towards solving the problems of society. I realize that a number of African universities, including the University of Professional Studies, Accra, have begun what we call case study researches, meaning that students, before they exit universities, are entitled to writing a thesis, and they just do not choose any topic. They go into industry, okay, find out the problem of industry, and their research is tailored towards resolving that. So the research comes out and it is solving a specific industrial problem. So one recommendation that I would give is that the mass production theses that are in partial fulfillment of academic certificates or qualifications are outmoded. They just sit in our libraries and then warm the shelves. Why do we not tailor our researches towards solving problems of industry? And number 2, when mass production researches are also done, it is important that there should be a database where all these are showcased so that industry can use that as a bank of resolving their problems wherever the need arises.
Yes, with regards to the database, AAU has the DATAT program that it runs, and that is one of the things that the DATAT program looks at solving. Mr. Wao, do you have any final words for our viewers today?
Well, I think that the challenges of higher education are not limited to Africa. It, however, looks as though in the case of Africa, the pace at which we are resolving the issues of higher education is slow. So there is the need for some agency from all stakeholders, including students, practitioners of higher education, donor partners, academia, higher educational institutions, governments, and all. Also industry, so that we can catch up with what is happening in other jurisdictions in the world towards making higher education more meaningful to solving the problems of African economies.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Awal, for coming, and thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you.